Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Livia Cohen-Shapiro. Livia is a pioneer in the intersection of yoga and psychology with a dedication to embodiment. She is known for weaving together yogic teachings, disciplined asana, and somatic psychology in clear and meaningful ways, inspiring teachers and students alike toward greater safety, trust, and the discovery of their own truth. She is known for her wit, humor, and fierce love, as well as her ability to actually teach yoga so you make it your own. A scholar practitioner, her passion for learning and irreverent reverence is infectious. Her methods of teaching straddle old school lectures and new school unconventional experiential models. So hello, Livia. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk to you today because I feel like your work is really an important and timely work right now, especially for the yoga community. So I'd love, before we get into some details about your work, just to hear a little bit about your story and the interesting parts of your history that have led into this work that you do.
Hmm. Well, first, I just want to say thanks so much for having me. I've listened to many of your episodes before, and it's really
Awesome.
just an honor to be here with you. So thank you. And then in terms of my story, my journey, I've never really had another job other than teaching yoga. I started teaching yoga when I was 19.
Oh, awesome.
When I was in college, mostly because I was obsessed with yoga
Yeah.
and took all of the classes I was a work study student at the gym
Hmm.
at the University of Vermont. And the woman who was running the yoga program left in the middle of the semester. And my boss was like, well, you take all her classes, just, do something. So I just kind of got thrown in there, and I had another job, like a desk job, for 2 weeks after I graduated college, and I was like, oh
No
no,
way. No way.
no way, no way, not for me. And so much to my dad's dismay at the time, I was like, I'm just going to figure it out. I'm going to teach yoga, and I did, and flash forward a few years from there, I was convinced that yoga was the heal all kind of method. And I developed a program for an eating disorders outpatient clinic,
Mm.
a whole curriculum. And so I was teaching that. And what I came across was that as I was teaching this curriculum, the students' disordered eating behaviors, the symptoms, were getting worse.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, okay. So what's going on here? And I just very quickly realized that I was kind of outside my scope,
Yeah.
and also outside of what I understood was possible for yoga. I realized how much kind of um, naivete I had about it,
Yeah.
and at whatever, or in my early 20s. And I also realized that the way that I wanted to teach yoga wasn't possible without a certain skill set.
Hmm.
Um, and I was also deeply not interested in living where I was living. So really, a big way towards my future was, okay, I need to go to graduate school.
Yeah.
And so I made my way to the somatic psychology master's program at Naropa, and always wanting to actually take those skills and bring it to the yoga community. And so I really started in my studies kind of culling the information so that it would be useful specifically to the yoga classroom and yoga teachers. And I started really implementing what I was learning and studying and researching, and started really playing with what does it look like in a yoga private or a yoga classroom, or maybe this would be useful for a group of teachers, and then vice versa. I started bringing the yoga way more into the therapeutic session,
Mm.
and then actually my good fortune was that the style of yoga that I was heavily involved in at that time and was a teacher of, Anusara Yoga, imploded on itself.
Yeah.
And that was a really big boon in my life, actually, because that disillusion created an opportunity for me to start speaking up and providing just like for the first time really in my life, I started saying, well, hey, what about looking at it from this lens, or what about this way or that way? And people started listening. And then the whole sort of online school courses that I do now was sort of born from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you bring up a bunch of interesting points, and the first one that I wanted to just ask about is, or have you explore a little more, is this idea that seems, it's changing definitely, but it seems somewhat pervasive in some circles. This idea that yoga is going to heal everything, and I think what you're bringing up is kind of inviting in this new wave of more interdisciplinary focuses that do draw on the wisdom of different therapeutic models that are going to kind of fill in the gaps, because a lot of people bring to the table a whole host of traumas and emotional experiences that they think are going to play out on the mat, but then the mat almost becomes this new place for a form of escape. I can't even remember how many times I've heard someone say, "Oh yeah, I come onto my mat to not think, to leave this planet in a certain kind of way." And yeah, I like that feeling of being out of body, but there's then the question becomes, well, why am I seeking an experience of being outside my body through my practice? So do you have any thoughts on that, on just that paradigm of yoga being first of all, like a kind of a prescription for everything, and then on the other hand, this idea of yoga as being some kind of like transcending the body experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. I think that, okay, well, here's one of the, I think, challenging pieces to understanding yoga in our current context and in the West, is that yoga is, and this is what makes me very unpopular with a lot of the therapists, because yoga is a somatic psychology. It is one of the original methods. Yeah. And like the idea of like what we could now call in the literature and in, even pop culture, mindfulness. That is a direct descendant of Buddhist philosophy, the teachings of yoga, like Taoist philosophy. That, like, we don't have a market share on, therapists don't have a market share on teaching mindfulness to clients. Mm-hmm. And so yoga, in the broadest sense, it really is a somatic psychology. We have movement, we have a theory of mind. So we have a theory of body, a theory of mind, a theory that addresses, illnesses of all kinds. We have a medicinal component to it. We have meditation. It's really a whole thing. And the way that it's been widely taught in the West is obviously, as you know, very bodied. It's really heavily weighted on the asana. And I'm not convinced that it's necessarily bad that that's happening. I think that asana can be really profound and wonderful and useful. But what's happened is some of the other components have sort of, the yoga psychology or the psychology of yoga has sort of dropped off, and now we're seeing a reemergence of that. Now, where I take particular, and this is now what makes me a little bit unpopular with the yogis, which is that I don't think it's really always very useful to take a Western psyche and keep plugging an Eastern, and trying to fit an Eastern psyche into a Western psyche.
Yeah.
That produces a lot of issues when you start taking, especially around the concept of the ego, when you start trying to make a Western psyche understand and even live by the rules of what is meant to be an Eastern ego or not have one, we get into a whole host of tricky business.
Yes.
So that's why I actually really like to bring the Western somatic or body-based psychology to the yoga, because we're teaching Westerners. Mm-hmm. So we have to address the very nature of having a Western psyche.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's trouble teaching an Eastern philosophy to a Western psyche. And that is one of the things that sends us out of our bodies more. Mm-hmm. And there's that preference, right? There's some yoga traditions that are transcendent, And then there are some yoga traditions that are much more about descending into the body. And I don't pretend that I don't have a bias. I have a strong bias to being in the body, descending into the body, way more than transcending out. So, I'm not, if you're on a transcendent path, bless your heart, hallelujah, but that's not what I'm about.
Yeah.
So, and I think that this, I don't even want to say conflict, but like juxtaposition of the Eastern mind and the Western mind actually adds to this belief that the transcendent path is, it feels good, it's the way, and it just creates a lot more dissociation, and flooding than actually healing.
Yeah. So I love what you said about the ego, because I feel that I feel the same way. In fact, I think it's so problematic that we use that term ego to understand something like, for example, the ahamkara from Samkhya philosophy, which is often translated as ego, but really it means I maker. And if you look at it just as the I maker, or that which functions to organize the experience around me or mine, it's a concept that just explains, how things function. It's not a moral precept. It's not something that is morally loaded in the way that the term ego is. So, you see this all the time in the way that words are used to translate certain other principles. I mean, I think it's like, let's just, use the Sanskrit itself and then try to kind of tease out the nuance of it, so that we're not kind of bringing to bear all of our, psychological hangups and socio-historical bullshit into what we're reading or what we're trying to understand. So I'm so glad you said that. I want to just have a very kind of like basic 101 moment on what somatic psychology is for those that don't know what that means, and how that is different from, traditional psychology or folk psychology.
Yeah. So when I say somatic psychology, I'm talking about the body being an integral part to understanding the mind. So the body being the place within which we experience where our troubles might be, but also where really as a huge resource and support for healing any of those troubles. So the other thing that's interesting with the somatic, that this word somatic, is I love to link it back into the yoga, actually, because somatic is of the body, of the soma. And the soma in the yoga has several translations. Soma can be like the moonlight, that the way, the quality, and like it's just like a full moon now. And as I've gotten older, I used to always joke, like, my mom's like obsessed with the moon. And I'd be like, what are you doing? You're so lame, And now I'm like, oh, like I have to, go towards the moonlight. And I love to just sit at my window and like let myself bathe in that light. And so the soma being that moonlight, there's something about that quality that it is actually the quality of light that is needed if you're going to go into the troubling or dark places inside. It doesn't work to like take a bright, shiny flashlight or like that, huge, intense, bright light of the sun and just be like, let me show you this thing. It requires a much more delicate quality of light. So the soma as that quality of light that helps us to understand what's happening within the darkness of the places we can't see. Then we also have the soma as like the elixir of life, right? The very nectar of life, the thing that is life-giving. And so any somatic psychology is really about harvesting the life force. You want to call it prana, life force, shakti, chi, whatever, but harnessing what is most life-affirming and trusting that your body has so much innate wisdom within itself that it actually can unwind in a very specific, meticulous way that is unique to you and yet still part of patterns that we might see in nature.
Wow, that was so beautiful. Thank you for explaining and outlining the various kind of definitions or translations or meanings of soma. That's such a beautiful way to explain what that represents. And you're right, like it's so nice that this term can bridge the two traditions, because we do see soma in the Western tradition as well. Mm-hmm. So, now just kind of let's get critical and talk a little bit about what you think are the main challenges for the yoga community, since your work is really very much for yoga teachers. So I would love for you to just kind of deconstruct what you see as happening, from a more kind of cultural critical perspective. And then we'll get into a conversation about how this work is going to, move us in a direction of change or transformation. So so any critiques you have, maybe 3 or more?
Yeah. Gosh, well, I actually think that where I want to start is by saying that I think that there's actually a lot of good happening.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, getting someone to do downward facing dog or uttanasana, or just stand on their 2 feet, or sit in a chair and feel the current of their breath, at the end of the day, that is better than it not happening.
Yeah, totally.
So I think that by and large, the yoga is a good thing, and the amount of yoga that we have happening, a good thing. So I want to preface it by saying, in the context of, I think there's a lot of wholeness and goodness at work here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, that said, we have a variety of, issues. One is, at the fundamental level, an Eastern practice being taught in the West, and our failure to accept that, or accept really, it's like sometimes there's a lot of resistance to really allowing the yoga to radically change us. We want the yoga to fit in the pretty box of the Western ideal of marketing. So the way that we are proliferating yoga is not on yoga's terms, it's on our terms. And I think that is not working that well. Mm-hmm. It might be working to the sense that we're getting more and more people doing yoga, but we're also, I don't know if we're doing a great service in the way that we are marketing yoga, and the way that we are asking yoga to be this thing that maybe it's not. Mm-hmm. And that's a tricky thing, because we also need to meet people where they're at and make it accessible. And so there's that tension between accessibility and sort of not watering it down too much. And that's always a hard thing. Then there's this piece of what happens once you're in deep, mm-hmm. And this is true, like in any relationship. Like I was on the phone with my mom yesterday, and I had an argument with my husband. My mom was like, "Well, didn't you see that in him before you got married?" And I was like, "No, of course not. Of course I refuse to see that." And she was like, "Well, why not?" And I was like, "Because you never get married to the person who the person actually is. You get married to the idea of them. We don't like get into yoga because we see all the truths of yoga. We get into yoga because we see the good of yoga." Mm-hmm. So what happens then when you're, in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, is that you start to see that what it really is to be in a long-term monogamous relationship with yourself and with a practice is not that pretty. Mm-hmm. And that's how the shadow works, actually, is that we need a certain amount of safety and security and ground to really let the shit fly. And so what happens a lot of times in marriage is, you're a year in or 2 years in, and you're like, holy crap, I had no clue. And it's because you signed a sacred contract together, and somewhere deep in your psyche, you've relaxed enough that more of your true self is emerging. And the same is true in yoga. And we don't have a lot of tools, I think, across the board of really helping students move through those places, and even ourselves as teachers move through those places of deep difficulty. We don't get the luxury of moving through a practice and it only being feel good. We always will come against these places of pain and suffering, and even sometimes it might make some of our habits worse for a little while. And so that requires a whole other skill set and tool set of how to work with the material that the yoga is eliciting within us. I always say that the yoga is deeply resourcing and healing, and it is also one of the most eliciting things you could possibly do, because it's bringing all this stuff to the surface. And then what do we do with that? So I feel like there's really not a lot of, well, I shouldn't say there's not a lot of that happening. I think that there are other people like myself really teaching to that juncture, but we need more of that, in my opinion. And then I would say, if I'm looking at sort of my three big critiques is, that this problematic of East-West and how yoga is being brought in. Then this shadow piece, like how do you stay in the practice? And then I would say the third sort of biggest thing, in my opinion, is the dynamics around power, privilege, transference, countertransference, erotic countertransference with teacher and student. I think there's a lot of, and then, issues of enmeshment and codependence. I was going off about something the other morning with my, something, I don't know, I got stirred by Facebook or whatever, and I was...
So many things get stirred by Facebook.
So many things. And I started laughing, and I was like, it doesn't seem like there's a guru in sight who's not interested in sleeping with their students, so I'm always going to have a job. Doesn't seem like it's stopping anytime soon.
Yeah.
And so, time after time after time, I see, the teacher, whoever's in the seat of the teacher, use their power in a not very good way. Or something happens with a teacher, they fall from the pedestal, whatever the story is. And the level of shock that runs through that community, to me, I'm sort of like, well, how did you kind of expect this not to happen?
Yeah. And
so it's a really tricky situation between how do we take back our power? How do we, become individuated, and also recognize, like, we do that as students, but then as the teacher, to preach on about getting our students individuated and independent and not being enmeshed with us. When you're in the seat of the teacher, that's not actually the student's responsibility. That's yours, because you're in the seat of power and privilege in the dynamic of the relationship. So it's really hard to balance how can the student, find their own resources, and also how can the teacher step out of the way enough that they might be able to do that. And that's a hard responsibility to take on as a teacher.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we really have the luxury of not doing that anymore.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it seems like we are definitely moving into a period of post-guru in the West. But for me, I never really felt called to say that I had, a tradition. I just never met a teacher like that. And I have met a teacher like that now, but I don't consider him my guru. However, how devoted I am to his teachings and how much I believe in what he's offering. I mean, you could sort of map that onto, I don't know, a guru shishya kind of thing, but but I don't experience that power dynamic being there. It's more like he has a knowledge that I want to have, and so I'm going to stay with him so long as I have a passion to acquire that knowledge experientially and intellectually. And so, what is what, from your perspective, is the difference of dynamic between these types of contexts where where it's like the more or less traditional, at least traditional in the West, how we've come to co-opt it and all of the unhealthy baggage that we have. And then this other context where it's like it looks from a certain vantage point like it would be the same, and yet there's a different kind of something happening there. When do we cross the threshold into an unhealthy power distribution?
Sure. Well, yeah, and So again, let me first say that I think that having a teacher is a wonderful thing
Yeah.
and a deeply, deeply powerful thing. And I have my teachers
Hmm.
who I'm very devoted to, and and it's always so amazing, like the kind of the hoops and leaps that one is willing to do for their teachers, right? Like
Hmm.
um, the way that we put ourselves into service for them. And I actually think that that is a very beautiful thing, actually, when we're able to, open up our heart and put ourselves in service of a lineage or a person. Um, that I think actually is a really lovely thing, just like how we might do that for our parents.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm not of the mindset that, you know, let's all go rogue and like not have teachers and like, uprise of the student. We don't need anybody kind of, no, not at all. I
Yeah.
think that it's about finding the appropriate um, relationship. And sometimes the teacher student relationship looks a lot more like a parent child relationship.
Yeah.
Sometimes it looks a lot like um, a mentor relationship. So like really guiding them, letting them emulate you a lot and be in this process of discovery together. A lot of times there's a therapeutic transference that occurs. There's a healing that occurs. And then there's sometimes then there's like a collegial relationship that gets built. And that by the way, that method is something that I've studied deeply with my teacher, Melissa Michaels. And she has a whole map of how we work with mentoring individuals. And, she really normalizes the different stages. And there's my daughter, Olive.
Hi,
Uh,
Allah.
um, she really normalizes the stages that a teacher-student relationship could look like.
Mm.
And so I'm not of the mindset that it's like the teacher-student relationship must look like this. I think it can look like a lot of different kinds of relationship. But one of the fundamental things I think about having a healthy relationship with one's teacher is that um, you're never out if you don't choose to be in.
Mm.
And so by that I mean you can come and go as you please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not like the more you pay, the more you pay, the more workshops you go to, the closer to the inner circle you get.
Oh God.
It's
Yeah.
not like that. It's like, great, you can come to this workshop, awesome, I love you. You can't come to this workshop, awesome, I love you. There's no, it's not the quality of the relationship and the intimacy of the relationship is not dependent on how much you pay and how much you show up. That there's a resonance between the teacher and the student at a level where you come as you can. And I've had relationships where it was like you have to pay in, you have to get closer, you have to do more, otherwise you're out. And with the two women who are my long-term mentors and teachers at this point, never once have they ever said to me in overtly or covertly, you're out because you didn't come this time. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a big marker of health of student-teacher relationship, is really allowing, as the teacher, really allowing the student to come and go as they need, just like we would do as a parent, obviously setting boundaries and being close and all of that, but really allowing the child to move away from you and come back, and move away from you and come back. And I think that's really overall a big hallmark of health. And it can get really twisted because if you're a teacher in a studio and your class is dependent on numbers, you need the students to keep coming back to a certain amount so that you can get paid.
Yeah.
And so the way that we're marketing to them, it's very like, come again, come again, come again, right? And so it adds to this like need of them to come again, come again, come again, as opposed to really being able to stay rested in oneself and being like, you come and go as you please. The yoga's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. This is here if you want it. The well is here if you want it. so with the marketing piece, it gets tricky there. And then the longer you stay with a teacher, the more stuff comes up, right? So you get into conflict with them. A lot of teachers don't know how to deal with conflict with their students. It's very normal for there to be a rub or a conflict between a teacher and a student. That's a mark of health, actually, not a mark of necessarily a problem. And then also there can be erotic countertransference that happens where we fall in love with our teacher or our students. And how do we work with that? And I'm even going further out now and saying that there's a very specific kind of erotic countertransference that I'm seeing in the yoga world, which is like a spiritual countertransference, where you experience like the way that spirit is coming through you and into you and coming into your life. You're misattributing it to being dependent on the teacher and vice versa. So, and if as a teacher we don't kind of cut that cord, then there's a lot of problems.
So in other words, you're saying that the spiritual experience becomes completely dependent in the student's mind on the relationship rather than the teacher kind of helping to cultivate the conditions for the student to have the experience freely.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you're teaching, let's say teaching asana, I think there's a phase where the student believes that they need to come to your class in order to do those asanas. But if you're doing your job really well as a teacher, what you should actually be educating them to do is to recreate the asana at home. Mm-hmm. They need to not need you ultimately. Yeah. And that's a hard kind of shift to make, is this idea of I need to eventually become dispensable.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's really interesting and such important points. So I want to go back to one thing that you said, because it sort of brought up something for me in relation to you had mentioned, okay, the teacher-student relationship can take on many forms. It can take on the form of, parent-child, mentor-mentee, and other kind of dynamics. And now is the implication in you mentioning that all of these forms are okay? And the reason why I'm asking that is because, for example, someone like Matthew Remski, he would implicitly, at least from my understanding, criticize a relationship of teacher-student that takes on the form of parent-child because, at least again, according to my understanding, he has sort of an implicit idea that it needs to be egalitarian, whatever egalitarianism means in the context of this relationship. But I feel like he would be critical of a teacher-student relationship taking the form of parent and child, whereas at least what I'm sort of understanding from you is that not always the case, and that maybe can be a healthy, process for some people. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so I just don't. Okay, so projection, transference, countertransference, these are not bad things.
Yeah.
Right? These are not bad. Oh, I'm projecting. Oh, I'm transferring my unfinished mommy business onto my yoga teacher. They're not bad. They're human. Yeah. These are naturally occurring human phenomena. They don't not occur.
Yeah.
They always occur. So I think that the first step is, or at least kind of for me, I'm not thinking like, oh, I want to eradicate projection,
right,
or I want to eradicate transference. Not at all. I just want to use the projection or use the transference in a way that is actually both beneficial and non-malfeasant. So it's not going to create harm and it's beneficial. And that's really the therapeutic, I would say the therapeutic model, right? When you go to counseling, basically you sign a form that's saying, we are agreeing to, I'm going to pay you $100 or $125 an hour, and I get to transfer all this crap towards you, and you're gonna know what's coming at you, and you're gonna spin it around and help me see something where my blind spots are. We're gonna work on these relationships together. And part of the reason that that's going to work is because I am allowed to transfer and project and all of that, and you're going to call me out on it. Mm-hmm. That's what the therapeutic relationship is. And so where it gets tricky with yoga is that when students are coming to yoga, they're not signing that. They're just signing, you're going to teach me downward facing dog. Right? Or if you sign up for meditation teaching, you're not signing up for, I'm going to, you're just signing up for meditation. You're not necessarily investing in this therapeutic model of relationship. Now, that being said, just because you don't sign up for that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I know that's a lot of negatives in that sentence, but it's still happening. That phenomena is just naturally occurring. Mm-hmm. And so where I might say back to Matthew, like, okay, if you want it to be an egalitarian relationship, awesome, let's work towards that. But let's also be realistic. Then we have to eradicate teacher-student, even the term teacher-student. You can't have a teacher-student relationship and have it be egalitarian. That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like teacher-student that's different. That's saying the teacher has something the student doesn't have yet, and vice versa. So it's not egalitarian, period.
Yeah.
So I think it's much more about honoring the difference that the difference makes. And sure, you could, if you want to aim towards the egalitarian piece and the equality piece and all that, I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm not going to do that, because I think that this other way, for me, it's also a little more interesting. There's also, like, just with the parent-teacher example, I just turned 33, and my teacher is 53-ish. Like, she could be my mom, right? We can't deny that. Like, I'm the same age as her daughter. She could be my mother. Yeah. So even just the age difference creates a certain dynamic possibility, right? It's easy for me to project mommy stuff towards her, transfer mommy stuff towards her, because she could be my mom. So, like, how could I possibly even, like, looking for this equal egalitarian thing is almost like, I don't really want to spend my time doing that when I could just accept the fact that I might transfer the stuff onto her, and let's have a conversation about that. Let's actually have a conversation about how I project the good mom onto my teacher and keep making my mom the bad mom. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also, sorry, go ahead.
I just think it's more interesting than trying to make it equal when it's not, period.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, and not only is it, as you say, natural for those transferences to take place, but also, I mean, to have a relationship where it's like, yeah, I'm perfectly aware that this woman is a mother figure in my life and that there's transference going on, but I don't care. It's a beautiful relationship. Like, there's can be beautiful expressions of relationships that have these kinds of qualities, that aren't necessarily just because they're hierarchical. And I love what you said about, because I've said this before in conversations about stuff like this, where you just cannot, hierarchy is not a negative term. People throw it around sometimes as if hierarchy implies something negative, but we could not, we would have a really hard time functioning as a society if there weren't levels of hierarchy that just made sense. I mean, obviously hierarchy can then be taken to the kind of, to a level of power and domination, and that's another thing, but, like, let's not conflate hierarchy with domination, right? And so that to me seems to be a little bit about what you're saying, that I don't know, a diversity of expressions of relationships doesn't always have to be kind of, I don't know, we don't have to level the playing field all the time, I guess is what I'm saying. So now I'd love to talk a little bit about a little bit something I heard you bring up in one of the short videos that I watched of you, where you're talking about self-care as an industry. And a lot of what we're talking about in terms of grappling with emotional trauma and using recognition of transfers and opportunity to move in the direction of fullness or equality or a sense of wholeness. And we could kind of brand that all as a form of self-care, and maybe inappropriately so. But the reason why I'm asking this is because I had an interview with Hari Kirtana Das recently, and he was talking about how or at least in his book, how self-care has easily slips into a kind of narcissism, where he wants to kind of emphasize, for example, the action of the practice, like the Bhagavad Gita. It's about your duty to your fellow beings, like your action in the world, showing up, being of service, and so do you see any danger of all of this kind of like self-analysis, self-exploration? Where does it slip into a kind of narcissism, and how can we avoid that and make that really turn this kind of self-exploration into something that is of benefit to others?
Mm. Yeah. I just sort of smirking because, I live in Boulder, which is like the land of spiritual narcissism. And the term I like to use is navel gazing. You're just like all, just, oh, my arm. Oh.
You see people do that?
I'm processing.
Do people say that in Boulder?
I'm deep in process.
No way.
I'm deep in process.
No, people say that?
I'm deep in process.
Oh my gosh, I want to go to Boulder just as a
Yeah, you come visit us anytime.
I just want to observe the people.
Yeah, you come visit us anytime. So, okay. When my daughter's 13 months old, and when she was about, I don't know, 7 weeks old or something, she discovered she had feet. And we had this like little like kind of like this like round cushion that she would sit in, and it provided just like enough kind of snuggle for her. And so I remember one day sitting on the couch, and she was in that little pillow, and she looked down and she realized she had these things connected to her legs.
Oh my gosh.
Feet. And she realized she could push her feet, and just like the level of intent with which she was, looking at her feet, or like the day she discovered she had hands, or the day she discovered that, like mommy had this face, and eyes that she could gaze into, like the way that we learn as babies, we discover, oh my God, like my hand and my foot and my nose, and, like I can crawl, it's like, it's so just amazing.
Yeah.
And so I think that process of discovery and being like enamored with one's embodiment is a very healthy developmental process. Just like we also come to realize, like somewhere along the way, we realize, oh, my mommy's not just my mommy is a person with, with thoughts and feelings and desires that don't include me, and so like we realize our mom and dad aren't mom and dad, they're so and so and so and so. They have proper names other than mommy and daddy. And so I think, this process of understanding ourselves again and again and again is developmental and appropriate. And that process, I think, gets kind of reflected back in the spiritual development. So we have psychological development, emotional development, physical development. We have spiritual development.
Yeah. So
someone could be 45 and be like a spiritual newborn. And I'm not using that in a negative or I'm not trying to be patronizing. I'm just simply saying they could be just awakening to this new emerging thing coursing through them. And a lot of times we want the physical development, the emotional development, the psychological development, the spiritual development to all be moving together, kind of emerging at one.
Mm-hmm.
And that sometimes happens, but not all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that we could have people who are, 40, 50, 60, and they're sort of being born at a certain level. And so because of the capacity to develop at these different rates throughout our life, what starts to happen is we get like that newborn kind of nascent narcissism that comes with that. There is a certain amount, just like kids are inherently narcissistic. They don't understand, like they think they are the universe because they are at that time. And so at one level, when I'm seeing that happen in an adult, I get curious about like, oh, like what is that really newborn part of yourself, that narcissism that has to come through. And so for me, it's always a difference between what is developmental and what is defensive. Because we've got developmental processes that can be happening at different times, but then they can also be turned into defensive strategies.
Yeah.
So for example, even like projection is a very normal developmental step in our psychological understanding. But when we start to get older, we should have a little bit more capacity to catch those projections as they're emerging. And so when we don't, then it's more defensive. Just like, okay, here's a good example with the yoga context, the magical thinking of the child. The magical thinking of the child is a wonderful, beautiful, necessary psychological function. It's like, if I wear my clothes inside out and sleep backwards in my bed, I'm going to have a snow day. Or something more serious, if I act this way or not this way, mommy and daddy won't get divorced, right? Or if I do this, mommy won't do this, right? Children need to have a sense of volition in their world. I mean, think of it. Think about being so tiny and the world is so big. I mean, of course, you're going to need to feel like you have some control and capacity to take a stand in your world. And so that in children looks like, if I do this, mommy will or won't do this. It's very based on the way we consistently or inconsistently tend to the child. In the adult, where it's become spiritually defensive and perhaps in need of some repair, is if I show up to this workshop, my teacher will give me preferential treatment and I'll get da 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 da. Or if I, invoke Krishna, then this is going to happen. Or if I do this, this is going to happen. And like, sure, putting yourself at the feet of grace is always a good thing. But like, let's be realistic about what can and can't happen. We don't children live in they only live in a karmic world. If I do this, then this will happen. And then when we move into our adult world, we understand that the world is karma and lila, both. And living in a world that is lila, which is that chance, is very scary. And so the mark of the adult is being able to live in a world that has karma and lila. The children live in a karmic world. Adults live in a karmic and lilic world. And then adolescents have to wrestle with this. This is why adolescence is very difficult, because we want the world to be karmic. We want the world to be lilic. It's like, that's why there's all this happening and stirring in this tumult of adolescence. And so if we don't step into, what's being asked for us in that way, we'll always sort of, I think, flip back into what is developmental can become defensive. So I know I sort of riffed off from your original question.
No, I love that, but I want to ask you a little bit clarifying about how you're thinking, because for me, I love the idea of karma and lila, by the way, as a developmental thing. But I would think that, the play of childhood would be something like lila, and then karma would be like the confronting of consequences, cause and effect that you really only learn as an adult. I behave this way. This is what happens. So what you actually
Yeah.
offered it in the opposite way. So what do you
Yeah.
mean by that? Can you just
Yeah.
unpack that a little more?
Sure. Thanks for pulling that out. So, well, I don't think it's always this or always that, because for example, I think what young children are figuring out is that it's not just chance, right? Like, those stacker rings. So they've got like the little cone and kids can like stack the little rings on top. And it takes a little bit of figuring out of, oh, I have to hold it with my one hand and then move my hand over here and then drop it down this cone. So there's this whole, like, they are learning cause and effect actually at a very early age. So they're learning about the nature of karma and that things aren't just chance from the moment they're born. And also children ideally are developing in a world where the caregivers are pretty consistent. So the child learns if they cry, their needs get met. If they do this, their need gets met. If they do this, they have to wait 5 minutes. So they're actually learning this cause and effect, I think, a lot earlier than what we often attribute. And children, I mean, we could say like Leela being the play of the universe. Sure, children do live in a magical world. They live in the world that's imaginary. They live in the world of fairies and gnomes and make-believe, and that's real for them. And so that, of course, has a playful, dynamic, chance, Leela nature to it. That's true. And I think as adults, we could benefit from living more in those imaginal realms. And I think that's why so many adults love yoga and love yoga philosophy and love yoga mythology, because it allows us to step into that alternative consciousness again as an adult. It's so beautiful, So, but I think that dynamic interplay of the karma and Leela is actually always intertwining from the very beginning.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for teasing that out. So now, as we sort of get towards the end of our lovely conversation, and this has been really interesting, I wanted to ask you, because I found out actually at the beginning of this that we share some teachers who are focused on more of the tantric philosophy. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about maybe how you see your own studies of Tantra and the teachings that arise out of Kashmir Shaivism, how these integrate with your own work.
Well, when I started studying yoga, I started studying yoga from art and myth and archetype, and really I was studying a lot more of like the murtis and the images before I even was into the asana. And I'm very fascinated with how archetype shows up in people and how image and form and personality all coincide. My mother's an actress, so I've always been very interested with how we can embody different aspects of culture and aspects of ourselves and characters and all this stuff. And so I think that really looking at the Hindu pantheon was something that was very alluring to me. And this idea of understanding that we can have a cohesive one and then have all these different facets of the other always made or facets of the one, rather, is what I'm trying to say. That always made a lot of sense to me. And so I find that the practice of body-centered psychology is really the practice of understanding all of those different archetypes, images, characters in you as they emerge in different circumstances. So rather than looking at, like, we could look at, Nataraja, we could look at Saraswati, Lakshmi, Hanuman, all these different deities, and we could pick apart, they're, holding the tamaru, they're holding this, and then, and understand the meaning of that. And it's really nice to take a look at that from the outside But then what's also really cool is to be with yourself in subtle movement or even just sitting, and you notice like a little sensation. Maybe it's like a little tingling in the back of your neck, and then like exploring that tingling a little bit in the back of your neck, seeing how your body wants to move in response to that, or if there's a color there or a voice, or even just does that sensation grow or shrink, or how does it want to move? We're doing the same study but from the inside out. So that's where I think that's one way that I think the somatic psychology and then sort of the philosophy of the yoga start to commingle in a really interesting way. I also think that somatic psychology, if you look at like just how we have like yoga as this umbrella term, and we have like classical yoga, tantra, different kinds of tantra, right? So we've got psychology, and then we've got like dialectical behavior therapy, and we've got somatic psychology, and we've got Gestalt therapy, and we've got family systems therapy. So there's some similarities of like having this umbrella and then looking at these different threads of lineage. And I find that it's the somatic lineage and the tantric lineage that are the most alike in their respective contexts.
Okay, awesome. So, so as we close, I wanted to maybe if there's anything else that you want to share. Actually, I wanted to ask you, what is ecstatic unfoldment? This is the name of your website.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, the name of my website. There's a lot of pieces in it actually. It's so funny when you name something or someone, you only see one part of it.
Totally.
You know, and then its name reveals itself to you, and you're like, whoa, I didn't see that before. That's so cool, you know? So, with that, when I was in my 20s and I was like, oh, I have to have a yoga website, I had like Livia Shapiro Yoga, you know, on like a blog spot or whatever. And then somewhere along the way, I decided to kind of, I don't know, make things more branded or like kind of try to conceptualize what I was up to. And I always really liked that asana, which is now called Chamakrasana or wild thing pose, some people call it. It's a kind of a arm balance, kind of a back bend. It's a very ecstatic pose. And one of its interpretations of the name is the ecstatic unfoldment of the enraptured heart. And one of the statues that I studied when I was interested in art history was the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini. It's a very famous, one of Bernini's most famous works, and it's this image of Saint Teresa being pierced in the heart by the divine. And what I always found so interesting was her, you know, surrender to this piercing nature. And she's not like blissed out happy. She's like kind of writhing in pain, but kind of really happy, but kind of like really stoned, and it just sort of had this whole piece to it.
Yeah.
So much her body and so much the divine. And that has always kind of been my experience in that particular asana. Like this I'm very much my body, I'm very much not my body. There's very much being penetrated and being penetrated by the spirit, but also being the spirit itself.
Yeah.
That interplay. And so, hence the name of the website. And over time, it has revealed itself to be more and more true of what I think I actually am about, which is how can we be so deeply in our bodies, so deeply present, so available to the current that's in us, just being mundane human creatures, and with the capacity, not only with the capacity to have the divine coursing through us, but to know that the divine is there.
Mm, mm.
That's part of it too. It's like we can have this body and we can know this body at like the level of muscles and bones, and we can have this breath and know this breath, and we can have this divine out there and study it, but we can also know that it is and be conscious that it is moving through us. And I think that's what some of the teachings of Saint Teresa provide us is like, not only is she in her body, not only is the divine there, but she knows that the divine is there. That's the whole point. It's like allowing oneself to being overtaken by the spirit in a way that is grounded and present.
That's beautiful.
So that's really what the website's about and what my work is about. And, it's sort of it allows me a catch-all, right? To have a lot of the body studies, a lot of the philosophy studies, and yeah, it's just remained a catch-all. And I can assure you that after having a baby, where the baby comes out of you, that's
ecstatic unfoldment. Okay. Wow, that's really beautiful. What a nice note to end on. So thank you so much, Livia. This has been such a pleasure. So just to close, I want to give you an opportunity we've already mentioned your website, ecstaticanfoldment.com. Do you want to share anything else, any workshops, courses that you're doing coming up that people might be interested in?
Sure. I always invite people to take a look at the website. There's a lot on there. So I think I teach locally in Boulder out of my home, weekly classes and working on providing some kind of bigger, more workshop type offerings. I travel and teach at studios. I teach in teacher trainings and cover a variety of topics. So you can catch me there, or, I love to be invited to places when it's a good fit. Yeah. I love to be able to do that. I think one of the things I'm getting to be more recognized for is these online offerings. I have an online school that has a whole host of different courses on it, and the one that's that's coming up most quickly is it's basically 2 weeks, but it's 4 sessions, and it's a class on embodied ethics. And so that's we talked about a lot of kind of the foundation of what it really takes to handle some of these ethical dilemmas in the context of yoga. And so we're going to work on how do we really cultivate our bodies as an instrument to understand how to make these ethical decisions, and what even is ethics and our responsibility in contemporary yoga. So I'm really excited. That's a new course, and that's going to start, I think, on the 17th. So I would definitely encourage folks to check that one out.
Amazing.
For sure.
Yeah, that's an incredible offering. And that's on your website, right? Ecstatic Unfoldment?
It is.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Livia. It's been a real pleasure.
You.
We'll talk to you soon.